Yeah, this is part of the 100 Day Studio Bedtime Stories series. I've been working on the 100 Day Studio project this whole time since the start of lockdown. And Alicia Pavario has been doing an incredible job of curating this bedtime stories season. And the brief kind of loosely has been to ask each reader to think of a text that they feel talks about a post-COVID or imagines a post-COVID world. But I wanted to talk about the kind of different conversations which have been emerging throughout lockdown. And I think we've all been really seeing the kind of impact of inequality in the built environment, and I wanted to read a text that discusses different power inequalities, and I had lots of different choices. I was frantically thinking today what I would read, because it was only the afternoon when I found out I had to do this, but I ended up, actually I'm going to tell you a few ones which I was going to read, which I also would recommend. The Good Immigrant, which is 21 stories written by BAME writers, which talks about what it means to be Black, Asian or minority ethnic in London today. And then also basically Everything by Zadie Smith. And then another one, Against Everything by Mark Grief. But I ended up picking The Descent of Man by Grayson Perry, which I'm going to read the first chapter from. So I will get going now. It's called Asking Fish About Water. Okay. Oh wait, I should probably introduce Grayson Perry, although everyone knows who he is. He's obviously an incredible artist and is always has been working for 20 years, 30 years on re-understanding tropes of masculinity and redefining those. So yeah, I'm going to read from the first chapter, Asking Fish About Water. Paddle your canoe up the River Thames and you will come round the bend and see a forest of huge totems jutting into the sky. Great shiny monoliths in various phallic shapes, they are the wondrous cultural artefacts of a remarkable tribe. We all know someone from this powerful tribe, but we very, very rarely, if ever, ascribe their power to the fact that they have a particular tribal identity. I think this tribe, a small minority of our native population, needs closer examination. In the UK, its members probably make up around 10% of the population, globally less than 1%. In a phrase used more often in association with Operation Yewtree, they are among us and hide in plain sight. I am interested in them because they wield the most power in the Britain and the West, yet they operate under cloaks of polite banality. They dominate the upper echelons of our society, imposing, unconsciously or otherwise, their values and preferences on the rest of the population. With their colourful textile phalluses hanging round their necks, they make up a huge majority in government, 77%, 79% of FTC 100 directors and 92% of executive directors, and in the media, lots. They are, of course, white, middle-class, heterosexual men, usually middle-aged. And every component of that description has historically played a part in making this tribe a group that punches far, far above its weight. I have struggled to find a name for this identity that will trip off the tongue and does not clutter the page with unpronounceable acronyms like WMCMHAHM. The white blob was a strong contender, but in the end I opted to call him Default Man. I like the word default, for not only does it mean the result of not making an active choice, but two of its synonyms are failure to pay and evasion, which seem incredibly appropriate considering the group I wish to talk about. Today, in politically correct 21st century Britain, you might have thought that things would have changed, and somehow the great white male has thrived and continues to colonise the high status, high earning and high power roles. His combination of good education, manners, charm, confidence and sexual attractiveness, or money as I like to call it, means that he has a strong grip on the keys to power. Of course, the main reason he has those qualities in the first place is because of what he is, not what he has achieved. John Scalzi, in his book Whatever, thought that being a straight white male was like playing the computer game called Life on the difficulty setting Easy. If you are a default man, you look like power. I must confess that I qualify in many ways to be a default man myself, and I feel that by coming from a working class background and being an artist and a transvestite, I have a cultural distance from the towers of power to turn around and get a fairly good look at the edifice. When we talk about identity, it feels natural to immediately think about someone who stands out against the background, someone unusual, someone distinct. The distinct thing about the default man is that in many ways he is the background. Somehow, his worldview, his take on society, now so overlaps with the dominant narrative that we can easily mistake them for each other. We can't unpick his thoughts and feelings from the proper right-thinking attitudes of our society. It is like in the past when people who spoke in cut-glass, RP, BBC tones would insist they did not have an accent, only northerners and poor people had one of those. We live and breathe a default male world. No wonder he succeeds, for much of our society operates on his terms. Default man's worldview is woven into government, the media, and business practices, giving the fabric of society a bias, sometimes obvious, sometimes very subtle, in favour of his sex, race, and class. He prioritises rational goals like profit, efficiency, self-determination, and ambition over emotional rewards like social cohesion, quality of life, culture, and happiness. Centuries of patriarchy have fashioned the world to reflect and favour the middle-class masculine viewpoint. In order for equality to flourish, default man's ideology has to be unpicked from the fabric of society and laid out along all the competing viewpoints that we can more easily weave a just world. The adherence to being individuals is the nub of the matter. Being individual means that they achieve something good. It is down to their own efforts. I talked to several very successful men who worked in the financial sector, and time again they would describe themselves as mavericks, individuals that stand out against the herd. They are very aware of the boundaries they break, because they are carefree spirits, but they are blissfully unaware of the boundaries that hold everyone else back. They think they got the job because they are brilliant, not because they are the default man. And being a default man, they therefore presume that they are more competent than other default men. If they do something bad, it is also down to the individual and not to do with their gender, race, or class. If a default man commits a crime, it is not because fraud or sexual harassment, say, are endemic to his tribe, coughs. It is because he is a wrong 'un. If a default man gets emotional, it is because he is passionate. Whereas if a woman were to be, it would be often blamed on her sex. Default man doesn't just look and feel neutral, he embodies neutrality. But it is a position all the same. Default men dress to embody neutrality. It is not that they are neutral. If George Osborne had dressed up as a cross between Flashman and the Grim Reaper instead of a business suit where he delivered his budgets, perhaps we would have had a more appropriate vision of who was controlling the nation's finances. When we talk about identity, we often think of groups such as black Muslim lesbians in wheelchairs. This is because the identity only seems to become an issue when it is challenged or under threat. When our identity is working perfectly, we are unaware of it. When we are forced to become uncomfortably aware of our sex, race, or class, It often signals bias in the system. Our classic default man is rarely under existential threat. Consequently, his identity has tended to remain unexamined. He ambles along blithely, never having to stand up for his rights or defend his homeland. What millennia of male power has done to make a society where we all grow up accepting that the system, grossly based in favour of default man, is natural, normal, and common sense, when it is anything but. The problem is that a lot of men think they're being perfectly reasonable, when in fact they're acting unconsciously on their own highly biased agenda. Default man feels he is the reference point from which all other values and cultures are judged. He might not be aware of it, but default man thinks he is the zero longitude of identities. He has forged a society very much in his own image, to the point where now much of how other groups think and feel is the same. They take on the attitudes of default man because they are the attitudes of our elders, our education, our government, our media. Default man has had way too much to say in shaping our internalised ideals. He has shaped the internalised selves which we all try to live up to, versions that fit within his needs. The Department of Masculinity has an office staffed by default men in all of our heads, constantly sending out unconscious memos. If default men approve of something, then it must be good, and if they disapprove, it must be bad. So people end up hating themselves because their internalised default man is berating them for being female, gay, black, silly, or wild. It is difficult to tweezer out the default man effect on our culture, so ingrained it is after centuries of its rules. A friend was once on a flight from Egypt. As it came to land at Heathrow, he looked out onto the rows of West London mock Tudor stockbroker belt houses. Pointing them out, he said to the Egyptian man sitting next to them, "Oh well, back to boring old England." The Egyptian replied, "But to me this is very exotic." And he was right. To much of the world, the default Englishman is like a funny foreign folk icon in his bowler hat, his Savile Row suit, and his Hugh Grant accent, living like Reggie Perrin in one of those polite suburban semis. All the same, his tribal costume and rituals have probably clothed and informed the global power elite more than any other culture. Leaders wear his clothes, talk his language, and subscribe to some version of his model of what society should be. Over the centuries, empirical clear thinking has become branded with the image of default man. Not necessarily on purpose, but they were the ones granted the opportunity, the education, the leisure, the power to put their thoughts out into the world. In people's minds, what do professors look like? What do judges look like? What do leaders look like? It is going to be a while before the cartoon cliché of a judge is Sonia Sotomayor or is that of leader Angela Merkel. The very aesthetic of seriousness has been monopolised by default man. Practically every person on the globe who wants to be taken seriously in politics, business or media dresses in some way like the default man, in a grey Western two-piece business suit. It is not referred to power dressing for nothing. We've all seen those photo ops of world leaders, colour and pattern shriek out as anachronistic. Consequently, many women have adopted this armour of the unremarkable. Angela Merkel, the most powerful woman in the world, wears a predictable, unfussy, feminised version of the male look. Hillary Clinton, in running for president, opted a similar style. Some businesswomen call this necessity to tone down their feminine appearance as taking on the third gender. The most pervasive aspect of the default man identity is that it masquerades itself very efficiently as normal, along with natural, is a dangerous word, often at the root of hateful prejudice. You and your ways are not normal is a phrase often blatantly thrown in the face of oppressed minorities. The thinking behind such attacks is behind every decision that shapes the banal, everyday structures of our lives. We need to constantly call attention to these seemingly small injustices, for we may find, like turning off the humming extractor fan, that it seems dramatically more pleasant without the irritations we have come used to. As Cher Carter, author of High Octane Women, writes, unlike first-generation gender discrimination, intentional acts of bias against women, women in today's workforce, especially those working in traditionally male-dominated fields, are experiencing a much more camouflaged foe. Second-generation gender biases that are impeding their advancement and adding stress to their lives. According to researchers at the Center for Gender in Organizations, second-generation gender biases are work cultures and practices that appear neutral and natural on their face. Yet they reflect masculine values and life situations of men who have been dominant in the development of traditional work settings. Of course, this weird minority, these curiously dominant white males, are anything but normal. Normal, as Carl Jung said, is the perfect aspiration of the unsuccessful. They like to keep their abnormal power low-key. The higher the power, the duller the suit and the tie. A Mercedes rather than a Rolls, just another unremarkable old man chatting casually to prime ministers at the wedding of a tabloid editor. When talking about identity groups, the word community often crops up. The working class community, the gay community, black people, or Muslims are always represented by a male community leader. We rarely, if ever, hear of a white middle-class community. Communities are defined in the eye of a default man. Community seems to be a euphemism for vulnerable lower orders. Community is others, is other. In her essay, Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, published in 1975, Laurie Mulvey coined the term the male gaze. She was writing about how the gaze of the movie camera reflected the heterosexual male viewpoint of the directors, a viewpoint that is very much still with us, considering only 7% of top 200 Hollywood movies in 2015 were directed by a woman, and only 2% of the cinematographers in 2012 were female. The default male gaze does not just dominate cinema, it looks down on society like the Eye of Sauron in The Lord of the Rings. Every other identity is othered by it. When I was at art college in the late 1970s and early 1980s, one of the slogans the feminists used was, "Objectivity is male subjectivity." This brilliantly encapsulates how male power nestles in our very language, exerting influence at the most fundamental level. Men, especially default men, have put forward their biased, highly emotional views as somehow rational, more considered, more calm down, dear. It still seems to be a prevalent attitude that men are the rational ones and women are somehow victims of their own emotions. Under the heading of banter, one respondent in the Everyday Sexism project reported a colleague referring to lady logic as a way of dismissing a woman's opinions or feelings. However, as Hannah Rosine wrote in 2010 in an article entitled "The End of Men" in Atlantic magazine, over the years, researchers have sometimes exaggerated those differences and described the particular talents of women in crude gender stereotypes. Women as more empathetic, as better consensus seekers, and better lateral thinkers. Women as bringing a superior moral sensibility to bear on the cutthroat business world. In the 90s, this field of feminist business theory seemed to be forcing the point. But after the latest financial crisis, these ideas have more resonance. Researchers have started looking into the relationship between testosterone and excessive risk, and wondering if groups of men, in some basic hormonal way, spur each other to make reckless decisions. The picture emerging is a mirror image of the traditional gender gap, men and markets on the side of the irrational and over-emotional, and women on the side of cool and level-headed. Women and exotic minorities have often been framed as passionate or emotional, as if they, the default man, had this unique ability to somehow look round the side of the most interior lens, the lens that is always distorted by our feelings. Default man somehow had dispassionate, empirical, objective vision of the world as a birthright, and everyone else was at the mercy of turbulent, uncontrolled feelings. That, of course, explained why the others often held their view that were at such odds with their supposedly cool, analytic vision of the world. Others, in this case, being sections of society that have developed good emotional intelligence and take their own and other people's feelings seriously. People who care more about people than they do about being right. People who might make a better job of running the world than default man. Default man has been governing much of our world for a long time. He has done many things well, but it is time for him to relinquish his dominance. I think diversity and power can only make for a better society. Women and minorities bring a very different life experiences to bear on their decisions. Things are changing. Feminist arguments have permeated deeper into popular discourse. Their scales are falling off more and more people's eyes. Even men are starting to think that the world might be a better place if women had an equal shout. A revolution is happening. I am loath to use the R word because bearded young men, and it does tend to be men who resort to such means, usually characterise revolution as sudden and violent. But that is just another unhelpful cliche. I feel revolutions that really affect lasting change happen thoughtfully in peacetime. A move away from the long dominance of the default man is happening, but slowly. Across the world, political correctness is morphing from madness into common sense. Equality must change from feeling disruptive and feeling necessary and comforting. We need to refigure what it is to be masculine so that men can handle an equal society. One could argue that with its impulse to dominate, masculinity is at odds with modernism and its drive towards a fairer society. Masculinity might just have had an undemocratic streak. Men need to examine what is going on in the darkest recesses of their gender and question its relevance to a good modern society. One of the central issues here, and the reason that this book is called The Descent of Man, is that as women rise to their just level of power, then so shall some men fall. The men who find themselves justifiably passed over or demoted will inevitably feel angry that they are bearing the brunt, but they will be bearing the brunt of a very necessary corrective. They may rail against women, but principally they will be victims of their own unhelpful masculinity and dominant elite of other men. Power is key. The nature of our leaders in politics, in the boardroom, in the media, in culture, in the classroom, shapes how people think. The face of power is starting to give a better reflection of society, but a good likeness is still a way off. Okay, I'm going to end it there. But thank you so much for joining. Thank you. And that was The Descent of Man by Grayson Perry, the first chapter. Thank you so much.